emailing me and I haven't had nothing. They were talking about that this morning, that maybe you didn't.
All right, are they in, Dave?
Everybody's in. We
All
have
right,
6 participants at this point.
6, that's because everybody thinks it's at 2 o'clock. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Special Committee on Election Security meeting for the 3rd of June. Now, a little trivia for you to contemplate at the beginning of this. There is a famous popular music song that starts, "It was the 3rd of June, another sleepy, dusty Delta day." Now, you all have to tell me the name of the song by the end of today's meeting. The first order of business is to call the roll. I'm Brad Cook. I'm in New London, New Hampshire, and I'm by myself. Barbara?
Good afternoon. My name is Barbara Griffin. I am in Bedford, New Hampshire, and I am by myself.
Kate?
I'm Kate Hanna. I'm in Bedford by myself.
Kathy?
I'm Kathy Seaver. I'm in Farmington, and my husband's a couple rooms away.
Tom?
Tom Sherman. I'm in, where am I? I'm in Rye, and 1 or 2 sons may be wandering through, but currently I'm alone.
And Jane?
I'm Gene Van Loan. I'm at my home in Bedford, New Hampshire, and my wife is in the other room.
All right, welcome. A couple of announcements. At some point during this meeting, the draft report will probably be posted on the Secretary of State's website so that those members of the public who are joining us can follow along. A couple of things to say about that. First, a lot of changes have been made to it, or suggestions for changes have been made to it since that happened. So it's not exactly what you'll hear, because I've had calls and emails and things from people making editorial corrections, and Senator Sherman called me with a number of changes to his subcommittee section for clarity. And so for everybody, we're posting it so you can follow along with it, but it's probably not what we're going to be talking about in its entirety. The next thing to say about it is it has an inaccurate Exhibit A on it with the wrong names of the committee. Was a draft when Secretary Gardner hadn't finalized the committee, and so that will be replaced with the accurate one. So I don't need 100 emails telling me it's wrong, because one was enough that pointed it out to me. So the next order of business for the committee is the acceptance of and approval of the minutes of last Thursday's meeting, which you've all received. We could have a motion.
Don't we have Wednesday and Thursday?
Wednesday and Thursday. Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Stand corrected. So if I could have a motion to approve Wednesday and Thursday's minutes.
I'll move.
Okay, thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, any discussion, corrections, additions? If not, the chair votes yes. Barbara?
I abstain. I didn't read both of them.
Okay. Kate? Gonna get Kate unmuted here.
Sorry, yes.
Okay. Kathy?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
And Jean?
Yes.
Okay. As you know, today's possibly 3-hour meeting is devoted to the review, action on amendment, editing, changing of the draft report of the committee. As I indicated a minute ago, I've already received a lot of editorial corrections and some substantive corrections. When we get to the sections that were drafted by subcommittees and integrated into the report. I may call on the people on the subcommittees to explain it to the extent we need further explanation. Errors in the report that went out are mine. I take responsibility. So does everybody have a report to look at so we can follow along? You also received 2 documents that Barbara Griffin, who was my checker on the drafting committee, came up with. One is a table of contents, and the other is an action matrix with some statutory references, and for which I thank Barbara a lot for doing that, which we can use to make sure that we're checking. I tried to put into the report where I could identify action items that we may not have already acted on, a little yes or no thing to indicate that we need to take action on them. So everybody's got their report from the top. On the first page, in the paragraph that starts Secretary Gardner promptly, in the third from the bottom line, should say unilaterally deciding on the expediture he appointed, not decide and appoint. So that was just my mistake, and that should be corrected. On this, and any other comments on the first page? Okay. On the second page, where I included the understandings, summary of the CARES Act, which is embroidered with an exhibit, as you saw, from Bud Fitch, and then the operating principles, which we came up with, and Jean was responsible for suggesting to us. Tom Sherman had one suggested amendment on the operating principles, and that was in number 1, second line, encourage that all possible steps be made to safeguard the health and safety instead of reasonable. So, I mean, all possible, I suppose, means everything under the sun that could possibly be done in the world. But I think Tom was trying to emphasize, and I'm speaking for him, but I think he was trying to emphasize that safety of voters and poll workers was the top priority that we have, and therefore we should look for everything we could find.
Reasonably possible.
That's fine with me, but I just wanted it to be stronger than reasonable. If that's
This is.
understood.
Reasonably. I'm going to have to be doing a couple of things today that's going to make it even more interesting to be the chair, because I'm taking notes on all the editorial stuff at the same time that I'm trying to herd all you cats. So, but reasonably possible is fine with me. Anybody have a different characterization they want to make on that one?
Mr. Chair, I don't want to make a different characterization, but I will point out that I think it's consistent with Jean's sticky note in regards to today there are CDC guidelines and processes. A month ago, there were different ones, and there will be different ones likely in September and November.
Yeah, and we, when we get farther down in the report, especially when it goes to the PPE section,
Right.
Senator Sherman and I talked about a prefatory statement that you'll see later, but basically says this is based on the information we have the first week of June. Things are going to change, conditions are going to change, and everybody should continue to watch and adjust accordingly. So, Tom.
I was just going to ask a procedural question. Maybe Deputy Secretary of State Scanlon can answer this. We are having minutes prepared. If we agree to specific language, is there something so it's not just dependent on Chairman Cook to remember or write these down, is there somebody actually taking active notes while we're doing this, or minutes that could be making sure that we get the wording that we all agree to correct?
The answer is yes. And Jessica, let me just ask you if you are actively doing that. Jessica is in the office and she just said, yes, she is.
Okay,
So that way it takes a little bit of the burden off the chair but if Jessica could let us know if she has any question on the exact phrasing, I think that'd be helpful for the
that
chair.
would be helpful. And then there's another question that's going to come up at the end on procedure, so we might as well ask it now. I can do really well on Microsoft Word until it comes to integrating paragraphs and indentation, and my machine just won't cooperate with me. And if somebody, if Jessica or somebody knows how to put it into similar spacing and indentation, that would be really helpful, because we're all working remotely, so I don't have clerical help to do it. And it drives me nuts. To say nothing of the fact that every time I change something on this thing, it went from Times New Roman to some other Calibrini or some kind of type, and that just, it's not fun. But anyway, okay, so that's page 2.
Chairman,
Yes, sir.
while we're talking about these kind of administrative things, I just, it's just a suggestion. I would hope that we're not going to obsess about actually drafting specific language today, unless it's something simple like we just did, which is, was no problem. But I'm sure we'll get into other areas where we'll all agree on what the concept is, whatever change we want to make. But rather than us getting down into the weeds and trying to draft by committee, I would hope that we agree on the concepts, and we're going to have another crack at this, so that's all.
Okay, yes, thank you. I appreciate that, because drafting by committee is even worse than drafting all by yourself. At the top of page 3, when we had the basic assumptions, Senator Sherman had another suggestion that I'll let him explain after I just state it. He said there should be a 7th and perhaps first assumption that the safest way to vote in the time of a pandemic is absentee. That's sort of an assumption that we've had throughout these things, but it's not stated. And Tom, I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I agree with all these assumptions. I don't have any exception to them. And the closest to what I was trying to do was, I think, number 6 or something like that. I'm sorry, number 5. But I really, the whole reason we're doing all of this is because of COVID and the impact on the elections. And I think we've all agreed that the safest way of voting is going to be absentee. So I thought perhaps number 1 should be something like the process of voter registration and casting ballots with the lowest risk to municipal officials, election workers, and voters will be the absentee option, or something along that line. Just the assumption is that the safe, and I think Jean has said this, I know I've said it, I think we've all agreed that the safest thing, number 1, we hope everybody votes, but the safest way to do that for everyone involved is absentee.
Jane, you came up with these. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think I have a problem with that, because I think it's been an implicit understanding of all of us that because of, as long as it's clear, and again, not to get into the details of drafting, as long as it's clear that this is something that we're doing because of the pandemic, and that we're not making any kind of overarching statement that we favor absentee voting versus in-person voting, since that's really beyond the fact it's beyond our purview, I certainly wouldn't agree with it.
Right. So I think
Okay.
maybe just to wordsmith is to start out with a little phrase that says, in the presence of the 2020 COVID pandemic,
Yeah.
and then go into that sentence.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
To make everybody more comfortable that we're not, this is a 2020 statement. This is not a 2022 statement.
Right.
Or for Barbara, it's not even 2021.
Well, thank you, Senator, but I understand it, but I was pretty comfortable with the assumptions as they were. I don't know that the people who vote in Dixville Notch would agree with you. And I don't,
I can guarantee you that the Department of Health and Human Services would agree that the people in Dixville Notch would be safest if they didn't vote absentee.
but that's a general
If they
statement.
voted.
We'd all be safer if we didn't go outside every day. Because the minute we step outside, we're exposed to at least probably 18 other coronaviruses. So I'm not trying to diminish the issue, but given the changes in the CDC guidelines over the last couple of weeks, given the changes in what is now being stated as the issues that are around this, I think the statement that the coronavirus will not have been totally eliminated as a factor which affects both elections is an accurate statement. I think for the, if you want to say, we all should be absentee, like I said, I'm safer if I don't leave my house. So I think it's sort of to unqualify it is
Other thoughts? Well, let's go down the list. I'm happy to put in an additional one that is limited the way Gene and Tom just talked about, saying it's specific to this year because of the pandemic. The safest way for poll workers and voters to register and vote is
Mr. Chair?
absentee. Yeah.
I think Barbara makes a good point on number 2, which is the coronavirus. If it would be okay with you, I can wordsmith an embellishment of number 2 that would combine my thought with number 2.
All right, you're on.
Just keep it simple.
Yes, sir. Kathy has her hands up.
Kathy,
Can we go back to what is number 1 here?
yes,
It's not September 2nd, it's September 8th?
it's September 8th. Yes, I was just going to mention.
Okay,
that.
all right.
September said that was pointed out to me, as I said to you in an email,
Yeah,
by the moderator of Milford, who somehow had a copy of our draft report, which was a mystery to me, but he did, and he made some helpful suggestions on it. So yes, but he said in his comment that the dates were wrong. November 3rd is correct, but September 8th is the primary. Okay, so Tom's going to send language before tonight, so I can get it into this thing. Down in the course of its public hearings statement, where we said the committee, consistent with its principle, consistently reminded those making such suggestions it's not a troll or charged to suggest changes. Since later we talk about some possible tweaks that may be made as needed, that could possibly be read to be inconsistent. So I would suggest putting the words basic system of election laws before election laws. And then the sentence at the end that says, however, certain changes may require an executive order or 2020 only changes in the law, which is consistent with the rest of the report. But if somebody only read to this part, they wouldn't understand it. So.
Yeah.
Then we get to section 3 when we start getting into substantive stuff. I want the world to know that I wrote the description of A, and it's the shortest thing in the whole report.
I do have a question, though. Do we have a dollar figure, Dave?
But are you prepared to make any comment on that report?
We're not quite at the stage where we can.
Okay. So whatever it is, it is. Tom?
Just a couple of typos in that first paragraph under Roman 3.
Yeah.
In the second line, I think it should be set its priorities
Yes, thank you.
without an apostrophe.
Yeah.
And then in the third line, I think this is correct. It should be, but that the federal funds are limited,
That's fine.
because there's a that up above that.
That's fine.
And I had a couple of more little things coming down there, if that's
Yep.
okay.
Sure.
In the third, under accounting firm, personal protective equipment, the third one is publicizing availability of action by mail. I didn't know whether we wanted to call it mail or absentee, because absentee doesn't necessarily require mail, since there are drop-off provisions.
If I could comment on that section, if you look at the table of contents, we called that section publicizing election procedures for 2020 in the body of the document. So
That would be fine too.
if you
Yep.
follow that list in the order of the paragraphs that follows, it should be accounting firm expenses, PPE, prepaid postage is actually the third section in the document. So maybe Jessica hopefully is catching this. Publicizing election procedures for 2020 is the fourth. And then in the body of the document, we go to leasing of additional ballot counting machines, because I think the other three things listed, which I think we all agree need to be addressed and are important, some of them are sort of in the non-appropriation, but I think that title will work a little better, publicizing election procedures, and that
Yeah, I like it better.
two need to be flipped. Well, I suspect it was your title because it was in your part of the document.
Well, yeah,
I
but you
never
know,
liked it.
but I wrote page 3 before I wrote that thing. So that's why I have.
And there's one last typo. If this line stays in, the Secretary of State hotline, I think there's a T and a doped.
Adopted. Now that line's not going to stay in. That's only if we adopt it, but you're right. No, I'm the dope that did it. Okay, so there are a bunch of changes. Well, not a bunch on PPE, but there is that prefatory statement that I mentioned before, which basically says this report is based on, or this recommendation is based on the situation in June. Conditions will change, and the Secretary of State should consider those in consultation with local officials, because these were all based on today. And Tom, if you want to speak to the PPE section briefly, that would be great, what your subcommittee came up with.
Yeah. Well, I'm just looking through it and make sure. I don't have, oh, there's one small change under additional considerations. It's like 3 pages into it. Barbara, you'll notice there aren't page numbers on here. But under additional considerations, physical design of polling place, number 2, For the protection of workers, every table will have plastic plexiglass shield. I just put in parentheses there, sneeze guard, close parentheses, because I want to make sure we're all using the same terminology, and that's what that is. So
Okay.
that's the only change I had. The one other was on the next page under booths. That's small letter B, number 1, surface. Barbara brought up the possibility of using some disposable paper on there, so I just added surface hyphen cleaned or disposable, changed between every voter. That's really getting down into the weeds, but I did want to be complete. So I'm happy to take any questions on the PPE section.
I think Kathy wanted to make a comment on it also. So,
I did, but not remembering what that was because I got my mind on something else.
Well, I just want to thank Kathy for her amazing help she was part of the subcommittee, so thank you, Kathy.
I do remember. Under the additional considerations, to say 3 lanes going into each table might be taken by clerks everywhere to think they have to have 3. We have 4 for presidential. We usually have 2 for town meeting, but for primary, we may have 3, depending on the numbers of absentees we get. So to say that there has to be 3,
Maybe we just drop the number, or however you want to say it, I'm
or
fine.
say separate lanes going into each.
That's,
Okay. I had a question.
yeah, sure.
I had a question about that too, because I didn't understand it but this takes care of it, so I'm happy.
so are
Okay.
you happy, Kathy, with separate lanes going into each table, and that's it for that line?
Yeah, for that line. And then further down, it assumes, and this isn't what everybody does, some people do. What we have are 8-foot tables. So on one end of the table, we have the person checking off the name. Then we have a stanchion that divides that person who's outside of the polling area from the person that's inside giving out the ballot. So they're at the same table. So later in this thing, you say that there's then going to be 2 tables to give out ballots. And in reality, there
Well,
could be,
right.
you could get a table, it's just half of the tables in the voting area and half's out.
What if we just got rid of the tables and said social distancing?
Yep, between giving out and, yep.
I had the same question in a little different, because my experience from seeing a number of situations is that there's no separation between those things at all. In other words, the people at the checklist have the ballots. You check in, they're checked off, and they're given a ballot right then and there by the person manning the checklist. no-
See, ours is 2
separate-
different people, but the same table.
Yeah,
I think everybody's different.
exactly. And
Right. I think I was thinking about Ward 1 in Manchester, and it's totally different from any of this, but
We can fix that and just make it more general.
so, Mr. Chairman?
yes, sir.
So is it clear, because I had this problem consistently, Tom, I just want to clarify this. A sneeze guard is that plexiglass frame that would be in front of somebody manning the checklist?
Yes,
That would, like they have in the grocery store?
correct.
Okay. And if you have because I know it's used in a couple of places here, a face shield, that's like the motorcycle helmet shield?
Right, it's actually got a plastic frame on top, and then it's got a transparent shield that drops down.
Okay. Over on the next page, since they're not numbered, Barbara, I agree. After number 7, undeclared table eliminated, there's a section on PPE supplies needed. I don't know where that goes to, and is it
Oh.
even necessary?
That's for the entire physical design of the polling place. So that's the inventory that you need for a polling place.
Okay.
So that needs another little heading above it that says suggested materials for polling place.
Right,
'Cause
or
you
you
have-
could, yeah,
You have physical design of the polling place. You need PPE supplies. PPE supplies suggested needs to be the heading, and then you go right into the droplet.
right.
I guess so. I just actually thought it was superfluous based on the prior stuff you've got in here, but
No, the polling place has the greatest need. If you go back. So one is, you've got everything from the town clerk's office to the.
They're exactly the same.
Drop off. So this one is really specific to the polling place. So it's got everything, wiping down tables and stuff.
okay.
But if Barbara, maybe you can wordsmith the title for that section of PPE.
Well, PPE supplies needed for the polling place sounds like the title, but
That does sound good.
I guess so, because if you look at the prior page, above additional considerations, there's a very similar, in fact, identical list, and it's prefaced with the sentence that says, all staff wear KN95 or N95 masks and face shields if sneeze guards are not available or unable to social distance to radius of 6 feet. And then it says PPE supplies needed, which I assume relates to all of the election officials and the polls in general, and so that
it is the same list for sure.
And it does-
It is very similar. The idea here, and you're absolutely right, Gene, there is redundancy, but the idea is that this section was on PPE. And so when I said additional considerations, I was going back to, I think it was Dr. Goldstein's concept of putting in some kind of template. What would be a reasonable design? Everybody can do their own thing, but having that in, and then what would be the PPE to facilitate that template? I'm not wedded to this. I'd rather have more PPE lists than less, and make sure each section has its PPE list, but it's not written
okay,
in
well,
stone.
at any rate, if Barbara's going to take a whack at it to just clarify it a little bit so that it doesn't appear to be either redundant or inconsistent.
I think what you could do is just take out that second list and leave it above additional considerations, have that list. I just want to make sure that it's inclusive.
Yep.
That nothing is dropped.
I think they're identical.
Yeah,
And then
go back.
we've got a numbering issue, because if we keep that list, we're going to make it number 8. If we don't keep it, we're not going to keep it. But the paragraph that starts, if a voter refuses, we've got to put a title on that.
That would be, that actually is, if you look at the way I did this, I had additional considerations. The first one was physical design of the polling place. And the next one is if a voter refuses. So you could put a Roman 1 and a Roman 2 if you wanted to, but
Can't use a Roman 1 and 2. That's the whole section of the report.
right. So
Anyway, I'll figure it out.
Isn't the
Yeah.
title of that really traffic flow? You're managing the traffic flow, and you're suggesting if people are not going to use the PPE, they're going to have a different flow.
yeah, it is.
Yeah, I'm just talking about what we're going to call it and how we're going to number it. Kate, you had your hand up.
Yeah, on the section about if a voter refuses PPE, I realize this is a bold comment, but governors in other states have required citizens to wear masks during COVID. Do we want to discuss the proposition of asking our governor to do the same?
Mr. Chairman,
Yes, sir.
I would like to speak to this because this is something I feel pretty strongly about. I don't know what the Attorney General's office has to say about it, if anything at this point, but personally, I don't think that it is illegal or unconstitutional for the state of New Hampshire to say, if you wish to vote in these circumstances, and assuming we have the same level or worse coronavirus problem, if you wish to vote in person at the polls, you must wear a mask, or you must have gloves if that's necessary, and we will supply them. And you're not going to have an option to do otherwise. So I feel that we don't need to get into this, or if we wish to get into it, that we don't make any recommendations whatsoever. But if you want to leave some options that people can do in their own municipality, but as far as I'm concerned, under these circumstances, just like Kate was saying, I don't know what other governors do or not, but I know they're not comparable, but if you want to go into my supermarket, if you will, you must wear a mask. And I don't see any significant difference here, especially since they have lots of options to vote otherwise than coming to the polls in person.
Other thoughts? Nick, do you have any comment on that if Nick's on? Is Nick with us, David?
Nick is on. I see his mute button keeps going on and off, but Nick, it may be your volume. Might want
Hello?
Yes, hi, now we got you.
Yes, so we understand that there are actually already some communities in New Hampshire that have already released local ordinances relative to face coverings. I believe it's Nashua and Salem that have passed local ordinances requiring them, for the most part, as I understand it, in most public areas. I don't have a sense one way or the other as to the position of the Attorney General. I don't know yet if that issue has percolated, but I do know that with respect to the Nashua ordinance, a lawsuit was filed by a resident relative to the requirement for face coverings. I believe his name is Andrew Cooper v. City of Nashua is what the case is. It's in Hillsborough Superior Court. I can probably find the complaint and send it to the committee if they find it useful. But just to keep in mind expectations of how the public may react relative to those requirements might be helpful for the committee's consideration.
Gene?
Let me, before other people start to chime in, let me say one other thing. And I recognize that the way it's drafted right now, we're not saying that we necessarily want to provide all kinds of options for somebody who doesn't choose to wear, whatever would be otherwise required for PPE. But if you're going to do it and even provide some options, the one that I would recommend against is allowing somebody to show up at the polls, decline to use PPE, and be given the opportunity then and there to vote by absentee. Because it's going to be, if you'll pardon the vernacular, a pain in the neck to be dealing with a bunch of people that come in and decline to vote in person, and now we have to jump through hoops to arrange for them to vote by absentee. We've got to take a ballot out there. We've got to somehow get them checked off the checklist when the checklist isn't out in the parking lot, and then get their absentee ballot in. And I also feel that for those people that would be inclined to decline to wear the mask, et cetera, they'll take that opportunity and abuse it. And I don't think we should offer that or encourage it. You either vote in person, like everybody else does, wear your PPE, and if you decline to do it, worst case situation, fine. Tom's other suggestions, you're going to have to get into a separate line and wait, and we'll take you when we can. In the meantime, if you're not going to be able to come in and stop the whole process. If we have to do that, well, we have to do it. But I don't recommend it.
So Kathy and then Kate.
Option number 2, closing off the line and getting them in another line and then reopening lines, that is more disruptive. And also, I believe, from either Nick, Bud, or Dave's perspective, wouldn't fly. We once tried to close the line just for like a half an hour to finish absentees, and we were really slapped for doing it. So closing the line, which is the option number 2, I think the only way you can do it is the absentee, because the law allows for absentees to be brought to the car and done that way. You don't check them off the checklist, you take them in and you process them as an absentee. So it's off the checklist when it's brought back in and processed as an absentee. That's a cleaner way at the election to do it. I would like to see this not have that option 2, close off machine line, that whole thing not viable to me at an election. I don't know about Dave or Bud or Nick would think about closing a line and just letting all the people with no PPE go through and then open the line again.
Kate.
Yeah, I also believe that people should be able to vote by absentee if they refuse to wear a mask. So I respectfully disagree with Jean on that and agree with Kathy.
So how about we preface this whole section with the committee strongly believes that everyone voting in person should be wearing the appropriate mask if the COVID-19 situation is still prevalent at election day, period. Then we say, if it is determined that voters have the right not to do that, comma, we suggest the following, and then have options.
But if we
That
just
way-
leave it up to the Secretary of State. No, I'm serious.
All right, we could do that.
Give us guidance, right? Because it's going to happen.
Mr. Chair, if I can just jump in,
Yeah, please.
say that we have dealt with similar issues in the past, whether it's, whether somebody can wear on their t-shirt campaign slogans and things like that, or whether it's the person coming in after the voter ID law passed and refused to show an ID. I mean, there are individuals that will test the system, and usually that results in a conversation with the Attorney General's office and the local election officials, and we figure out the best way to deal with that makes sure it protects everybody's rights but keeps the process moving.
Tom?
This was in there. I sort of sat down and thought about all the different scenarios. How could we accommodate? I'm absolutely fine with having the Attorney General do that, but I think it's a good idea to have that pointed out, that this will be potentially something that comes up, and what is going to be, so not necessarily having all these options there, because we don't want to make it sound like these are correct.
Right.
Jean has good ideas and Kathy has good ideas and a lot of experience. And I have my opinion. So I put everything I could think of on the table. But if the will of the committee is that we go back and we say, you know, the Secretary of State, with the resource of the Attorney General, will deal with that situation using what Brad said at the beginning. We strongly urge everyone to participate with face covering and social distancing. But in the event that a voter refuses, we will follow a protocol outlined by the Secretary of State or something like that. I just don't want to lose this whole section because I think it's an important thing for us to have in there as a consideration. But I'm happy to take out all the different options and perfect to Deputy Secretary of State Scanlon and his team.
Fine with me.
Works.
Okay. Just I know somebody's taking notes, but I'm compulsive on this subject. So we're going to take out the options. I got it. Got it. All right, next page. Prepaid postage. Now in the prepaid postage section, there are a bunch of changes that Senator Sherman told me about this morning that he wanted to make. The first one, and Tom, I apologize if the first one is one that I put in and you didn't put in, but I know we talked about it. Right before Roman numeral 2, on the next page, I put, and we can go back and talk about the prepaid mailing, and we have to talk about that anyway, but I added on a theory that, my theory, that we're going to decide to have one mailing before the September primary. Then I put, the Secretary of State may decide to do a second mailing prior to the November election if conditions indicated as necessary and funding is available. Because my thought was we were going to say, because of cost, we're going to have one every household mailing. And we've got to talk about what we're going to recommend, whether it's a postcard or whether it's an envelope. But that as to a second one, you know, if there's unlimited money in the world, I think a mailing every week to remind people what they should do would be nice, but we don't have that kind of option. So I know there's feeling for a second mailing. I think the compromise position would be to say, it would be nice if you could do it, but you got to decide at the time. So with that being said, and we can talk about that. I'm not wedded to that, but that was just my first comment. But on prepaid postage, initial informational mailing, I think we had consensus that there would be at least one mailing. I think we had consensus that it was going to go to every household. And there was a question someplace, I think in one of Gene's sticky notes, about how many households there are, but I didn't see them all, Gene, but I saw a couple. And
that's right. I think Kate, something Kate had written, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe it was something we got from Vicki Turner that said it was 561,000.
The 528,078 came from Vicki.
Okay.
Does it matter? Does the number matter if we're sending to all households?
No.
Only because it affects the amount of money.
But it's probably going to be different by the time this goes out anyway.
True.
Kate.
I would like to suggest that at the beginning of the prepaid postage section, we have something along the lines of Gene's assumptions or top priority goals or something like that, that would state, and we haven't all decided on this yet, but if we decide on this, the lead-in should be that the committee believes strongly that prepaid postage should be paid for two major elements. One is the mass mailing, and the second is the return of all absentee ballots, both in the primary and in the general. Something broad that would state at the outset what our consensus is about prepaid postage.
I think that's a good idea.
Mr. Chairman, can I just jump in real quick? And
Sure.
the draft report is now up and printable off the Secretary of State's website. And anybody that's interested can find it on the page that is dedicated to the product of this committee.
Thank you. I was seeing that chat in the chat room. So we would say at the first sentence would be something like the committee recommends that postage costs be paid from federal funds for an every household mailing and for the return of all absentee ballots for both elections, which makes eminent sense to me. I'm not sure when you're talking about stuff that's going out from somebody, you have to call it prepaid postage because it's not going to go if you haven't paid the postage, but that's okay. Tom.
I just wanted to make sure that we gave mention in the draft that I sent to Jean, to Brad. I had a section that is not in the final report, the final draft, and it talked about a pre-general election absentee mailing. That actually is picked up, the essence of that is picked up by Brad's statement. The Secretary of State may choose to underwrite a second mailing. And the concern, sorry about the background noise, the concern I had, and I think the reason Brad took it out, was that several people were concerned about including the checklist as a source for addresses for reasons, one of which is that the checklist is old, and two is that it may use up may use funds because of redundancies and inaccuracies. And so I have no problem with that not being in there, but I did want to recognize that we had this concept in the draft that talked about a single large mailing that would go out before the general, similar to the initial mailing that we're talking about. But I think Brad's comment actually does cover that and gives the Secretary of State wiggle room to do that if they have extra funds.
Right. That was the thought. Okay, and then we get to subcommittee recommends that Secretary of State adopt one of the following three options. The first option would be a postcard. Second option would be postcard with the tear off. And the third option is an envelope with a page and an absentee ballot application. Obviously, those things vary in price. We have the pricing grid as an exhibit to the report, if people want to get into that degree of weeds. I think one of the main recommendations in this section that makes sense to me, not being, I've learned more about the post office than I wanted to know during this committee. And I think one of the best recommendations is that the Secretary of State either have or retain a postage consultant or meet with the post office, or however they want to say it, to determine what the most efficient, most cost-effective means to get these things done, so 6 amateurs don't become postmasters. But how do you want to handle if we give the Secretary of State these three options? That's fine with me. If we want to pick one and say this is the one we recommend most, that's fine with me. And you know, in an ideal world, I'd love to have an envelope go to every household with an application that people could copy or whatever they wanted to. So, but that's up to the committee. So Jean and Tom both had their hands up.
Tom was first.
Okay, Tom.
I would just consider changing this format a little bit. I think all three have merit, but leaving it up to the Secretary of State unless the committee feels strongly, and saying the subcommittee recommends that the Secretary of State consider the three options or something like that. Consider adopting one of the three options or something similar. I just, rather than.
You already said that. Subcommittee recommends the Secretary of State adopt one of the following three options. The question before the
Right.
House is, do we want to tell them which one we like the best? Do we want to just give them the three to consider and let them consider it? Or
Okay,
any
my
of them?
vote
that
would
we don't wanna
be
do?
My vote would be to give them the three to consider and let them decide which is best, but that's up to the committee.
Jean?
Just a question that goes to what you're saying. On the next page, after the third option, says estimated cost of every household mailing is $100,863. Which mailing is that? Because I assume that there's a different cost for just a single postcard, a postcard with a tear-off reply, or a standard letter with an instruction sheet and an application for absentee ballots and or registration. Isn't there a difference?
The testimony from the post office was that for every household mailing or every door direct mail, you can do pretty much whatever you want in terms of what you send up to a limit. So the cost was the same.
For postcards versus letters?
That's what she said.
Okay.
Hey.
I missed that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, Vicky says up to 3.3 ounces. It's the same. Okay.
do we need to say one way or the other as to whether we are in favor of paying, let's say we go with B, which is the tear-off postcard, the so-called reply postcard, I guess. Do we need to indicate whether we are in favor of paying the postage for the voter to send this back in to the clerk? Which I am not in favor of, by the way, but I just.
I think we should be. I think we should be clear on whether we think we should do it or we shouldn't do it. I think there are a couple of things to consider in terms of cost. Even if the postage up to 3.3 ounces is the same price, the tear-off one. Correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, because you guys really drafted this and came up with the theory. But my understanding is the tear-off one would allow something to be sent back to the clerk that could get you an absentee ballot application or registration application. If we sent it in an envelope and we sent the application itself, I don't think we'd send both. But if we sent the application for an absentee ballot with every one, then that could be returned to the clerks in a number of ways, not just by mail. I think there's a logistical issue in a mailing to every household that has a return of anything, and that is it would be going back to a gazillion different places. And I don't know how you do an every place mailing that has to be returned to every town or city clerk in the state, and not to the Secretary of State's office. So, Kathy.
Because part of the information on the informational page will tell you to just go to the Secretary of State's website and look up your clerk.
Right.
And it gives the address, it gives the name, it gives everything you need to know to mail it back.
That's fine, but that presumes that it's not, that the address isn't printed on the return thing, that people have to write that in, which is fine with me. But it.
Well, the benefit of, I'm sorry.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
The
Go ahead.
benefit of going with the mailing that has a sheet and the application in it is you've actually just relieved the clerks of potentially one entire step, which is somebody requesting the application. You've sent it out to everybody. So rather than the clerk getting a request, then mailing out the application, you're getting the application going to everybody. If you've got multiple voters, they can copy it. They mail that in, and that's one entire less step for the clerk, one entire less mailing for the clerk. And so you're actually saving postage by having that included in this package. I hadn't thought of that until just now, but you're saving the clerk an entire mailing for those people who are doing requests.
Right. I mean, the price of materials would be somewhat different, but I can't believe it would be hugely different if you're talking about 2 pieces of paper in an envelope as opposed to a postcard that has 2 sides and gets combined and has a tear-off thing. I mean, I don't have any idea what the cost is, but it would seem to be that.
Right. Postage is the same.
Yeah, if the postage is the same, you know, it seems like notwithstanding the fact that there could be 5 voters in a household and they have to copy it, well, you know, give the voters a little credit. You know, I think I would favor recommending to the Secretary of State that it be in an envelope to all households with a simple instruction sheet and an absentee ballot application. Gene.
The thing I raised, because we discussed it a number of times, is the question of visibility. And I mean, Tom talked about political literature and, you know, what really catches people's eye. And I think there was some discussion at the time that a postcard would be more likely to be something that people would look at because they don't, if for no other reason, they don't have to open the envelope.
That's true.
And, you know, anyhow, and, you know, Secretary of State of New Hampshire logos can be put on it, which of course can be done on an envelope too. But, and I'm not advocating, but I just didn't want that discussion to be forgotten.
No, I think you're right. Tom?
Yeah, I just wanted to second what you just said, Gene, is that you can do whatever you want with the envelope because it's going to every household. So it's not going to have the typical address on it. It's just a blast to every household. So you can have your graphics that are eye-catching on the front of it. They will have to open it as opposed to just flip it over, but.
Yeah, and certainly mail that goes to resident is sometimes disregarded. Kate?
I think one thing that we may be missing on the envelope that encloses the actual application for absentee ballot is a distinct separate request for a registration packet. When we talked about the reply postcard, and Vicki had done a nice mock-up of that, it said, please send our household 3 applications for absentee ballot. Please send our household 2 packets for registration, and then you drop it in the mail. If it's the envelope only including the application for absentee ballot, I think we need to have maybe another sheet in there saying, please send me 3 registration packets.
Tom?
Except that the application, if you're not registered, you automatically get the registration packet.
Right.
So maybe I don't know why they would necessarily want to do an absentee registration and not do an absentee ballot, but that would be what you would be missing.
Kate?
I agree with that, and that's kind of a nuance that we all know, that if you ask for an application for absentee ballot, the clerk will send you an absentee ballot, and if you're not registered, we'll send you the registration packet.
Right.
But the average person out there who's not registered does not know that. And so there would have to be, I think, in that envelope, very clear instructions. If you're worried about not being registered, please know that if you ask for the absentee ballot, you'll get registered or something. It needs to be explained to the average person.
Right. No, I'd agree with that. Kathy?
Well, one of the second, third line down, but it doesn't have a box. And that's one thing I pointed out to Dave. That box is missing. It says, I am not a registered voter in this town. and need to have absentee registration. So it's right on the absentee ballot request. It's just not as clear maybe and concise as it should be, but it's still on the absentee ballot request.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, Kathy, one of the recommendations later in the report is having a separate box that you can check for COVID concern.
Right.
So putting in that checkbox for absentee registration, making, like Kathy just said, and putting in the checkbox for COVID concern, then you've got one-stop shopping and you're pretty much good to go, I think. But I just want to take back what I said about recommending all three. After this discussion, I would say I'd recommend C to the Secretary of State because it provides the most opportunity, most information, most opportunity at the same cost, and is also cost saving for the clerks by every request coming in as an application rather than a request first.
Barbara, did you have anything to add to this? Okay. Kate.
It just occurred to me, could we add to the envelope that contains the request for absentee ballot, just a check mark or something that the household could say to the clerk, also please send 3 more of these to our household?
Well, that's not on the application. That's not on the application, but you can put that in the instructions. And if you want more than one, please tell us. Barbara.
I don't want to, we've talked about this in discussion. I think we're trying to narrow it down for the report where we want to go. I think it's sounding like we probably ought to recommend one of the 3. But, I come back to at a certain point, there's some, responsibility. I have concerns that anything other than a postcard, I don't care what it is not going to end up going anywhere. As I said, you've got 4 seconds to get somebody's attention to respond. And if you have a number, like if we have a hotline for people to call with the recording, that might be the quickest way to do it, is to have the postcard with the hotline and let people call. I have some concerns about putting a big emphasis on the ability to register and get a ballot at the same time. And it's not because you can't do it, but here's my concern. We are pushing absentee registration. I'm not sure that that's covered by what the AG's Office of the Interpretation of the Orders is right now. I think that the orders that created this committee relate to gatherings of more than 10 people, and that's why voting can be done absentee because of a disability. I don't think that applies to registration. So I have a lot of hesitancy in that regards because I think we're sort of going off to the side a bit. But the other thing is that I heard a lot from clerks, and I know my clerk, is that registration packets have problems. So I want to do it in the way that I think the clerks can handle that the best, and maybe Kathy can answer that, because my guess is you've got somebody who's using this packet to begin the voting process and hasn't done it independently. They're going to have problems with what comes in, and I want to know how it works best for them.
Well, we've done it both ways, either with or without absentee, but the problem is unique office to office. And the reason for that is my office for years was super clerk. So I was very cognizant of what went on that registration form. So to this minute, we scrutinize those forms before they get to the supervisors so that there's not missing dates of birth. And that's not true out there in the whole world. Were it true, it would be a much simpler thing with a lot less problems. So I'm not sure how you get to that.
Tom.
I just wanted to make a point. If only 10%, if we mail this out, we get the information out, which is goal number 1, and we get just 10% response, That's 52,000 voters, or 52,000 residents, or 52,000 households, so it may even be more. So 5%, still over 20,000. I think that's a significant bang for your buck. If the buck is the same, whether it's a postcard or an envelope with the materials in it. So I would make the point that this, I really have gotten back to where the idea of the envelope with the application in it is going to make the lives of the poll workers hopefully better by decreasing same-day registration, and save money at the clerk's office and save time at the clerk's office, because this will be bypass that request process and they'll be getting applications rather than requests for applications. To me, it seems like it's time and cost saving.
Okay, we've been around this barn a few times and hadn't fallen down yet. How many people think we should give the 3 options? Raise your hand.
You mean list them?
No. How many people think in the report we should say we're giving the Secretary of State 3 options? We think you should pick one, as opposed to saying we think you ought to send an envelope or a postcard or something. We started with the 3 option thing. I think we were evolving toward the let's give them one option that we prefer.
Just question, why are they mutually exclusive, Brad? In other words, if you list the 3 options, can't we list the 3 options and say the one we favor? But
could do that. You could do that. Yes, you could do that. How many people, by a show of hands, how many people favor the envelope with the application in it and the all-inclusive simple application or instructions in it, as opposed to the other 2 as their first choice?
Okay.
All right, so that's 5. How many? The second and third options are sort of permutations of each other.
Oh, the first and second.
Well,
I mean, I think it's,
second
you
and
put
third
all
now,
3
because
in
we
and
just made the other one first, but yes.
you put all
Yes,
3 in
Barbara.
and you just say the majority of the committee feels that option C will provide the most benefit in the process for the voters.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah.
I mean,
Done. Not to be a dictator, but we're done. All right, so then you get to the next Roman numeral 2 on the next page, and the first thing in the paragraph that starts participation estimates, the last sentence was in there twice, probably for emphasis, but we think it's only necessary for once. So we've crossed out the second time. There's some editorial stuff for clarity that Tom called me with. He said he kind of jumbled up some of the language, or somebody did. And in A, it should be absentee registration ballot application, not requests.
Correct.
B should be absentee registration ballot for primary election, not application. C should be absentee registration ballot for general election, not application. He also suggested taking out the language verbal or mailed. And instead of saying application, saying material.
That's true in both paragraphs.
Yes, in both paragraphs.
That's true in B and C. And if you do that, then Brad's question at the end of each paragraph should read, the committee recommends that postage for the return of absentee ballots be paid for federal funds, yes, no. Because really, the part that I'll take all the credit for screwing this up, but what we were talking about is in B and C are the ballots, not the applications. So A is the application.
Right.
So I apologize for any confusion there.
No, that's, you did a lot of work in a short time.
The if I could just say one editorial comment, the fact that I was confused about this and just shows that this is not simple stuff. And so
Right.
my hats off to all the clerks in New Hampshire and the moderators and the supervisors for their amazing work on this.
Okay, and at the, I think that's, and I just want us to formally ratify this understanding, because we had a informal show of hands the other day on what we thought we should pay for. And I think the discussion today is kind of reinforced, but I want it to be decided by the committee that what we're saying we should pay for is the mailings to every household and the return postage for all absentee ballots. And my question there is whether we're also talking about the increased postage to send out an increased number of absentee ballots to the municipalities. And my understanding was we were not, but I just want to make sure we're very clear on what we're talking about. Anybody? Gene's shaking his head. Kathy's raising her hand, so we'll have Kathy because she raised her hand.
It's my understanding that the Secretary of State's office was going to use a formula to determine that. I mean, the postage is going to come from us, but they were going to use a formula, how many absentee ballots is last time versus this time, to reimburse, if that was part of the whole deal. David spoke about that, as well as time issues. So I thought that the towns, part of the reimbursement would come to the towns based on what we send out.
Well, it depends if that's one of our recommendations to reimburse that. I
thought it came out of committee that way. I mean, out of the subcommittee that way, but I may be wrong.
I frankly didn't remember. That's why I'm raising the question. I mean, certainly if we had unlimited money, we'd want to do that. And I think that would be helpful to the towns and cities. But the question is, how much money have we got? So, but what I'm saying is, forget that last nuance about reimbursing the towns. There are several sections in this postage thing that talks about postage that we're not talking about paying. What we're talking about is the household mailing and something having to do with absentee ballots. So I guess what it comes down to is, are we recommending that the towns be reimbursed for their increased postage, or is that just going to be part of their cost of doing business? Gene?
Can we just try to put some ballpark numbers to what we think we should be paying for so that we're all on the same wavelength? I'm not crystal clear on it. We talked about the mass mailing, and we've already agreed we'll give the Secretary of State 3 options and we'll prioritize one of them. And based on what I see now, the estimate is that for the postage on the mass mailing, it's about 100,000, and Barbara's work says the additional, the preparation, et cetera, is going to be arguably another 100,000. So that's a ballpark $200,000 item. Is that right? We agreed on that? Am I right?
I think we know the postage cost for the household mailing. I'm not sure it would cost $100,000 to do the printing because I don't know who does the printing.
Design and printing, I assume.
Yeah.
But
maybe David
okay.
or Bud could give us a little input on how much they think the printing cost for something like that would be.
I would think that Barbara's numbers are certainly in the ballpark. I think that would probably be a minimum amount.
Okay, Kate.
I have a question for Barbara. I had thought that your 100,000 estimate went to making a catchy postcard as opposed to the envelope idea of just printing and such.
Right, that was the ballpark that came from. So I'm not sure about paper because my personal experience is limited to the copy shop down the street from Ben and Jerry's in Manchester. So, you know, I don't know how the Secretary of State would deal with, I think what the consensus of the committee was, the envelope and the full page inserts, because I think now you're talking a folding process in production, which is not something the postcard would go through. So I think there are going to be pluses and minuses in the number. And I'll just say, I think for $100,000, it's $3.2 million. Put it in there. The Secretary of State can figure it out.
And that's the way I feel too, but I'm just trying to get some ballpark numbers. So if we can make the assumption that it's about $200,000, and as I understand it, the return postage for absentee ballots at the general election, which is a priority, is estimated at being somewhere between 273,000 and 414,000, based on what I have in front of me in the draft report. Is correct?
That's correct.
So if we, again, say that if we pick an average of 350,000, that sort of falls in between, or we can pick the high number. Let's say 400,000. So if it's 400,000 for the general election, plus 200 for the mass mailing, we're now talking about 600,000. The next question is if we also recommend doing the return postage for the primary ballots, the numbers are between 88 and 116,000. Again, let's pick 100,000. So we're talking, if we did those three things, we're talking ballpark numbers $700,000. Is that, anybody disagree with that? I'm not saying it has to go in the report in terms of putting in that total, but because the subsidiary numbers are right here. But for our own thinking and for the Secretary of State's thinking, you know, as to where we are and how much money out of the $3.2 million we're eating up on this, approximately 700,000 plus or minus, right?
Right. Tom?
Well, it actually, you know, if this is the report, it's in the report.
Right.
We just have to do the math. And if we agree, you know, I think it's, my feeling is it's money well spent, but I'm just one vote.
Kate?
Yeah, I have a question for Tom and your subcommittee. Did you ever cost out the return postage for the registration packet?
For the, that would be, actually that comes back with the ballots. So it would be, because your application, this is where it gets a little confusing, but you remember if you send in the application for a ballot, that form that all of us tried to smith a little bit, that will come back. The clerk will look at it. She'll find that your registration is either no longer valid because you've moved, or you're a new resident and you need to register. Then you'll get the packet along with the ballots. So that would be the outgoing. And then coming back in, you fill out the registration packet, plus you fill in your ballots. So that's one mailing. So that's included.
Okay, thank you.
Kathy?
And just to clarify a little bit more, because there's some chat about this too, Bud reminded us last time that if we are sending out the whole packet, we do write on the return envelope that it's going to include that registration, and we're allowed to slit the outer envelope to take that out. If there's time, if there's more meetings, the clerk, the supervisors can get that into the system prior to it being absentee election day registration. So it can be truly absentee registration processed before. So there's a mechanism to get it back out of the envelope, but it is one mailing back.
One other question.
Okay, yes, Gene.
I hope just one. In that event, Kathy, when everything comes back to the town clerk, you're going to get an absentee ballot filled out. You're going to get that in the inner affidavit envelope. You're going to get the mailing envelope. And also inside the mailing envelope, hopefully, only inside the mailing envelope,
Hopefully.
will be, yeah, will be the material to register, if you're, because we're talking about unregistered, and it could include a lot of other stuff. Copies of your license, copies of your water bill to prove your domicile,
Yep.
you know, whatever. Am I right?
It has to, or it's not a valid, yeah.
For registration purposes, all that stuff has to come in one way or another. Now, I'm asking this to, you know, the postage experts here. The postage we're going to prepay is going to be based upon a 2 to 2 ounce or whatever return envelope. Are we, what if it goes over? Because they stuff it with copies of their newspaper subscription or something.
Then we're gonna get it to the office with postage due.
Do they do that now? I thought they didn't do it
Yeah,
anymore.
we get some.
Okay, and so that means that you pay the postage, right? You
Mhm.
receive it,
It
right?
happens a lot with absentees anyways, because sometimes they're only regular postage to come back because they're one less envelope, but sometimes they're not. And
Okay, so the only then, and I don't think, unless you want to, maybe Tom can put it in this section of the report, since that is a possibility, but the remedy is very clear, postage due, we should pay for the postage due. In other words, if we're paying for the return postage on a prepaid basis, but the assumption of the prepaid basis is that the envelope is going to have a sort of an average weight, if you will, and we'll require that amount of postage that we've agreed to. But if it comes back stuffed with a bunch of other stuff, it'll come back postage due, and Town X will have to pay the postage due, and we should reimburse for that.
Kate,
I have two questions for Kathy. The first is, if tomorrow someone sent you or called you and asked for you to send out a registration packet to them because they're not registered,
Yep.
you would do that with just sending the registration packet? You wouldn't wait until the ballots are printed to send them out?
Absolutely.
Okay. Second question is, if tomorrow somebody sent in a request for absentee ballot and they were not registered, would you wait until the ballots are printed to send them both the registration packet and the ballot, or would you send them right out the registration packet?
I would send them out,
Okay.
the registration packet right off.
Okay, that's good. I was concerned that if clerks waited until the ballots are printed, then there'd be a very short turnaround time for.
Especially November, yeah.
Yeah, okay. And do you think that's guidance from the Secretary of State that would go statewide for everyone?
I think it is. I think it needs to be reiterated, not only because we just had an election and you've got a lot of newbies out there, but because it is a big election again, and it's been 4 years, and I think this is, we hardly get them for the smaller elections. So it's very much worth stressing in election training.
Mr. Chair?
yes, ma'am.
I would respectfully ask to include a reiteration of that in our report and ask Kathy to draft the language that we're suggesting that the Secretary of State guide clerks to that effect.
Oh,
Okay. Now, we have the question in Roman numeral 3 of the section on postage, where it says, total cost of postage, several factors, blah, 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 outbound postage from the clerk's offices. We would not be paying that if all we're paying is the return postage for absentee ballots and for the every household mailing. Is that everybody's understanding? So we would therefore strike 3A,
no.
okay? Kathy doesn't agree with that. How much would the increased postage on the absentee ballots add to the 700,000, Tom?
That's up in B and C. I think outgoing mail.
Outgoing postage of first class meter is 415,000, and
Right, it's basically doubling.
all right, so that's huge. So the question is, do we strike that in our recommendations, or do we keep it? In which case, we have less money for all kinds of other stuff. Gene?
I don't think I'm in favor of this, but I don't think it is doubled because
The same thing.
yeah, I mean, the point is, if we're talking about the outgoing under the CARES Act, all we can pay is to, to supplement, not supplant. So we would only be paying for the additional absentee ballots that were being packages, et cetera, that are going out compared to 2000, whatever the base year is, 2016.
Okay,
So
but
it
if,
shouldn't be the 415,000, for example. It should be, I don't know what the formula is, but you'd look at the formula here and it'd be something, well, if the absentee ballots in 2016 and the general election were, I forget all these, but whatever they are, whatever the participation rate was at that time compared to the projected participation rate, that be one for if we were to pay for it.
yeah, we don't know the answer to that question, but if the estimate is that it could be 50, 60, 70%, and it used to be 10%, it is a large percentage of that same number. But you're right, it's discounted by whatever the prior number was. Kathy and then Barbara.
Now I'm really confused because I thought that in 3, these were just the factors that we used to consider the numbers that we already came to above. So that number's already up there. Yes, Vicky's shaking her head, yes. So I'm quite confident that number is in C
What number?
already. It's already there. It's already part of it. It's not in addition to. This is just saying that the assumption we used was we're only going to get the difference, the increase.
Well, then Gene's 700,000 was wrong. It was there because he was talking about just sending it back. Because in C, for example, you've got outgoing postage and you've got return postage added up. And so it's 414 plus a minimum of 273 and a maximum of 415. So you're way above 700,000 when you combine the primary and the general election.
I don't know.
So that if you look back at the grid, that is correct. That it's actually very clearly spelled out. You've got outgoing at a 273 to 415, and then you've got return at 273 to 415. Isn't that right, Vicki? In any case, that's what this was on the grid. So the cost of a single mailing, whether it's outbound or inbound, is pretty much the same because you're sending the same weight.
No, but that's not the point. I think the point is for mailing absentee ballots back, we've never paid for it. So 100% of the cost of mailing the absentee ballots back should be subject to the CARES money.
Right.
But mailing the absentee ballots to the voter has always been paid for. And so we should only be, if we were going to pay for it, we're only entitled to pay for the spread between what it was in 2016 and what it will be in this year, right?
That's a given.
So the figures can't be the same.
But that's
right, Gene.
But it's still, if we were working off of Gene's back of the envelope total a few minutes ago of $700,000, that's way low, is my point.
If we were going to pay for the so-called
outgoing postage.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah. So back to my question: are we going to pay for the outgoing postage? And Barbara had her hand up for a long time, been very patient, so she's talking first.
Thank you. I sort of understand the discussion, but I think really, I just want to say, and I don't know whether people think this needs to go in here, we're doing the eternal balancing act that the Secretary of State's office does in nearly anything that controls election law. Only our balancing act is between getting the absentee ballot there and making sure that the poll workers and the polling place is safe. And when we're talking about these postage numbers and looking at how much they eat up, we really don't have a good handle on what the PPE numbers are for, all of the polling places. I was surprised, as was Kathy, at the Shield number. I sort of did it for the estimated a number and was surprised, but I think there's going to be a lot of other stuff. So I agree it's a lot, but I also think we could control the discussion by talking about who is paying the postage. If it is the return postage, are we doing that as sort of a prepaid thing that the Secretary of State is distributing to everybody? So that's pretty clear. That's going to come out of the CARES money. That's out of the SOS. If it's what Kathy was talking about, now she's mailing more absentee ballots. She knows how many absentee ballots she mailed last time. So she can, and this comes back to Bud and the accounting, the towns would need to be reimbursed for that difference, right? That's how that's going to work. So all we can do is get close. So anyways, that's my comment.
Which doesn't answer the question of, yes, I mean, you're absolutely right, but it doesn't answer the question of whether we're going to recommend to pay the town's increased cost, or we're not going to recommend to pay the town's increased cost.
Well, I think we have to. I mean, I think that was part of that's part of the goal of this committee, is to increase all this absentee activity. So why would we not say we're going to reimburse the town? And then the Secretary of State's office is going to end up doing a balancing act when they get final numbers on everything as to what they do. I mean, I think that's more important, to be reimbursing your local community for the increased cost of this effort than it is to be paying for Mr. Smith's return postage for the ballot. I mean, that's my read on it.
Okay, Jane.
I'm not agreeing or disagreeing with what Barbara just said, but I think there is a difference between paying the outgoing and paying for the incoming. Paying for the outgoing is not going to increase absentee ballot voting, because people are going to vote absentee if they want to vote absentee, whether the outgoing money or postage is paid for or not by the CARES Act, because it's going to be paid for by somebody else, not out of their pocket. So that isn't going to influence how many people vote by absentee. On the other hand, paying for the return postage definitely, or at least our assumption is, will increase absentee voting, because the voter will not be paying his own postage.
Kathy?
Wow. I do think that you can't make a distinction, and maybe Dave can correct me if you're wrong, if I'm wrong. I think you can't make a distinction in saying that we pay for all of the return and we don't pay for all that goes out. I think that we can only pay for that percentage that was caused by COVID. You're going to have that original amount anyways, with no COVID anywhere. So I kind of thought that everything was driven by that. But maybe because we never paid for it before, it would be allowed. I don't know. I don't think it would be allowed because it's for COVID issues, not just because we never did it before.
Well, we wouldn't have,
That's
wouldn't
just,
have-
that's
we wouldn't be-
on the
we
return
wouldn't-
postage.
a lot of us wouldn't be urging people to vote absentee instead of in person if it wasn't for COVID, because
That's true.
this one member of the committee at least thinks we've got the probably most secure and best system now without screwing with it, but that's a whole different issue. Well, we're going around and around and around, folks.
Dave was looking like he might want to chime
Yeah,
in, but
Dave, get me, straighten this circle into a straight line for me, will you, please?
I mean, you're wrestling with the $60 million question, and that is, the money is available to help us put on an election so that people can vote, exercise their right to vote, and do it safely. And we know that as a result of that and the current situation, the towns are going to incur some pretty significant costs that they have not had to cover in the past. And so, it is important that we keep the towns as whole as possible in that process. And then, the other part of that is how do we make it as convenient on the voters as possible? And that's where the discussion comes in. Do we pay the return postage on the absentee ballots? And there may have to be some compromise between those two issues. And that's why this discussion is taking, as long as it is. These are all great points that are being raised. And, I don't have a quick answer.
Kate?
I have a follow-up for Mr. Scanlon. Is this exactly the type of thing that we should be using HAVA funds for?
I think that, well, first of all, the $3.2 million that we have specifically for this purpose in CARE Act funds distributed through HAVA that's we're discussing the appropriate use for that money. We have had conversations about the other HAVA funds that we have available and how they're currently used. And to the extent that we dip into those funds to pay for this one-time event, we, at some point in the not too distant future, as a result of that, would be going to the general fund and asking for money from New Hampshire taxpayers to pay for the federal mandates that we're obligated to follow.
Which is another way of saying is the existing HAVA funds are almost all committed, which is the problem. Kate?
Just a quick follow-up. I would say, from my perspective, that if there is any election that warrants the use of those extra HAVA funds, or just a small portion of them, I would hope that you'd consider it.
Kathy?
Just for a quick analysis, we probably spend $20,000, have a budget of $20,000 for the entire town for postage for the year. And you're gonna say $300,000, well, up to $400,000 overspending. Oh my gosh, that's grounds for dismissal. You can't overspend your budget that much, So there's got to be some give and take there of reimbursement.
But we're not asking Farmington to pay the whole cost for the state. We'd be happy to.
No.
Tom?
Yeah, I just listening to all of this, I think it's the wish of the committee, were we to have adequate resources to pay the PPE costs, the outbound postage costs, that the difference, as Jean has pointed out, not the whole thing, but the difference for this year's absentee, and to encourage the safety of the elections by paying the return on the ballots. And frankly, I think these numbers are a little fuzzy because I don't think anyone expects 85% of voters to vote absentee. We don't have a postage specialist yet. And so I suspect these are going to be lower numbers total than what we're thinking for the postage, and that we should rank both of them as high priority. And we haven't, PPE we all believe is high priority, protecting the election workers and the voters, and give that kind of guidance to the Secretary of State that these are three high priority issues. The one question I'd have for Deputy Secretary Scanlon is recognizing what you've said about HAVA. Is there any of this that we've talked about in our introductory priority list that could be covered by the remaining security funds, which are 1.2 million? So if we look at all of this, and in the end, you're looking at 4 million rather than 3.2 million, do we have any wiggle room with that additional, staying away from HAVA, but going into the security funds? Does any of the list of possibilities match that description? Any of the descriptions match what would be appropriate for the security funds? And one other question is that there's a 20% match on all of this, which decreases the cost of each of these by 20% in a sense. So my gut feeling is this is all affordable. Our priorities are affordable. And they're affordable because we've used high estimates. We have not talked much about the security funding that's available if we go over. I think these are all reasonable priorities.
And so the answer to your first question is yes, there is some wiggle room. We have spent, and I believe we've communicated on this, in the last couple of weeks, but we've spent over $1 million in those security funds, and there is a program that was in place required by the Election Assistance Commission on how we plan to spend those security funds over a 5-year period after receiving them for security purposes. But the current situation does allow us to deviate from that plan to address the current needs. So there is some wiggle room there. And then just remind me what the second part of your question was.
Right. The second part was, aren't we essentially talking about 80% of these totals needing to come from our estimates? So first of all, we decrease it by, it's the difference between the number of people who accessed absentee last time for Kathy's purposes and the number that are getting mailed absentee ballots as a result of COVID. So that difference, that brings it down, as Jean pointed out. And then we've got the fact that this is an 80% match, not 100%. So that would bring down the cost. But I think when you start looking at these reductions, what we've done as a committee is we've said, these are good programs, worth funding. We want to make the municipalities whole, and we want to encourage people to stay home and vote absentee. All these three, the PPE and these two funding, outgoing and return, the reason I think we're struggling with them is that we think they're all important. And my feeling is that really looking at the numbers, doing the 80% rule and the Gene idea that, you're actually talking about the difference, not the total. I think we can afford it. And I think we should recommend these as a committee as something that would be a high priority, all three of them.
So just
Gene, go
just,
ahead. Yep.
yeah, I was just going to answer that yes, there is a 20% match. And, based on the numbers that we have crunched, it looks like the costs that the towns are going to incur are going to be that much above what we're going to be able to give them in the CARES Act funding for elections. So that's where the match would come from. But yes, that's correct.
Gene,
It looks to me, again, trying to come up with some round numbers, that let's go back to my 700,000, which includes the primary, includes the one mass mailing, not two, includes one. It includes the return of the absentee ballots for the primary, and it includes the return of the absentee ballots for the general election. And, that came up to around 700,000. Based upon some of the things we've been talking about with the match, and maybe we're overestimating, et cetera, let's say it's 600,000, okay? Now the question is, should we be willing to reimburse or pay for up front, since I think reimbursement actually ends up being a problem with the CARES stuff, and whether the state pays for it or the municipalities pay for it, but whatever, for the mailing out of the absentee registration, absentee ballots for the primary and absentee ballots for the general election. And although these numbers that are in here do not involve the spread under the CARES formula, if we took the total amount of 100,000 for the primary and 400,000 for the general election, that's another 500,000, and it isn't going to be that much. So we're looking at $1 million. Let's round it off. That's what I see as $1 million. So the question is, if we want to do those essentially four things, we need to understand that we have sort of pre-committed about $1 million. And I'll move it.
so the motion that you're moving is to keep the Roman numeral 3 in and the other things we've decided already.
Wait a minute, I don't know what Roman numeral 3.
Roman numeral
Don't do that.
3A is paying the outgoing cost of the absentee ballots
For both elections.
for both elections.
Yes, the incremental cost.
Right.
I think that's all we can pay.
Right.
Well, that's correct, but I just want to make sure we understand that what we are talking about, and the report would accurately reflect it.
Yeah,
I agree with you, Dean.
and we've already said that about 6 places in the report. Is there a second? There's a second. Any discussion? The chair votes yes. Barbara?
No.
Kathy? No,
Yes.
Kate, sorry. Well, Kathy's yes. Kate?
Yes.
Tom?
Yes.
Okay, and Jean?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Van Loan. We may turn the rest of this meeting over to you.
Please
Moving
don't.
along. The stuff at the top of the next page, we've already agreed will stay as written from our other votes. The question on the drop boxes, the question is, do we say to the towns and cities, if you want drop boxes, we'll pay for them, or not? Barbara?
Kathy has explained in her town that there's a Dropbox that they've modified that they use quite often. My concern about Dropboxes is not using them under certain circumstances. It's that having the towns think they're going to be reimbursed might be problematic because I don't see these Dropboxes going away afterwards. So that's my concern with this.
Kathy?
I totally agree with Barbara. I think I think it needs to be said whether they can or cannot use them, because currently they cannot use them, but the ones who have them can use them if that's the way it's decided. And the ones that don't either have to get their own. I don't think we pay for that.
Tom?
Yeah, I think this is optional for towns.
Right.
I would like to see it secure drop boxes for the clerks being able to be used to drop off absentee ballots, because I still think it's fairly ridiculous that I can go to the post office next door, pay $1 something and drop it through theirs, but I can't take it over to the clerk's office, who has also a drop box, pay nothing and not drop it there. I think that's a little crazy, but that's the way the statute is right now. I understand that many, my clerk already has a drop box. I think many drop boxes are out there. I think they're going to be there. They're going to be there after the election. I don't think it's a one-time expense. So I would agree with Barbara and Kathy that.
Okay, so we keep the paragraph, but the answer in the last sentence is should not be paid from federal funds. So the recommendation on drop boxes stays, but we don't pay for it.
Correct.
Okay. The next paragraph, so we're done with postage. Thank God. I'd like to be done with postage. Publicizing election procedures for 2020 elections. Kate sent a very nicely worded statement that I edited the living daylights out of because it was redundant to things that Tom had in his report. And I just want to recognize that it was very nicely done. The only question for us to decide is small Roman numeral 2 on the next page, which is the hotline question. Jean asked the Secretary of State's office 2 questions. One was on buying or leasing additional voting machines for the communities to use as additional machines to count absentees. And the other one was a hotline. He said they expressed being amenable to both ideas if we could afford it. So the question becomes, does the committee want to approve the establishment of the hotline with the caveat that it's got to be affordable in the money because it's not our top priority? And I would be in favor of that, just the way I said it, which is why I said it that way. But does anybody want to do it some other way or not do it at all?
I need to say this out loud. I'm in
Yes.
favor of it.
God bless you. You know? I knew I liked that woman. So anybody against what I said? All right, we're going to do it if we can afford it. And then we get to the additional machines question. I think there were a couple of objections to additional machines. And Kathy, I'll get to you in a sec.
Yeah.
The 2 problems with buying some additional machines, if there were 5 of them and it cost $50,000, would be that would create, assuming we ask towns and cities, do you need some more? Then only the first 5 machines would get allocated, and that would create winners and losers, which is unfortunate. The other was that machines last, if you buy them, they last forever, and they're not just used in the 2020 election, and therefore the CARES Act money might not apply, or only if the percentage of its life expectancy would apply. So what I did when I wrote the thing, I took the liberty to talk about leasing them. You can lease more, and it would only be leased for this year, which would solve both problems, it seems to me. The question is, and I don't know how many are available. I don't know how many more we get. I don't know how many are going to be asked for. So a lot of this is on faith. but that's why I wrote it the way I wrote it. Kathy and then Jean.
Does anyone have any thoughts or have talked to LHS to see if they even have 100, 200 extra machines laying around that could be leased? And if so, what the cost of that lease would be?
Jean.
Dave will, I'm sure, answer the question, because when I originally talked to Dave about it, we were talking about buying some. Then, of course, Bud chimed in with the bad news that that would be a CARES problem because you couldn't use them afterwards for anything but a federal election, et cetera, et cetera. But before we asked Dave whether or not they're leasable, and I don't know what the answer is at this point. Just so you understand what at least my proposal was, it was not to make these available to all the hand count towns that might all of a sudden decide they want to, you know, transition to machines, because that involves a whole training regimen and everything that, and Dave and I talked about this, and he said, no, we can't do that. The only purpose of this would be to provide sort of an inventory and a backup for the big towns and cities that have huge numbers of absentee ballots and machine count, and don't already have a spare or two that they can use to create a dedicated absentee box and machine. So how many that would be out of, say, 10, I don't know, but I don't actually think it would be a very large number, but you wouldn't know until you've asked. So Dave, do you know if they're rentable, leasable?
They are leasable, and just to start off, the cost of a machine, if a town were to acquire one now, is about $3,500. To lease one would be $1,000 per election. So if there was going to be a lease for the primary and the general, that would be $2,000. If we're just looking at the general election,
Just the general.
$1,000.
I
No
would think,
discount?
So it's bad economics to lease them. It's better economics to buy them.
and I would think this would only really be an issue for the general election.
Okay. And that solves a different problem that the moderator in Milford pointed out, saying that if you were going to use them for absentee ballots in the primary, you'd need 2 extra machines, not 1, because you have a Republican ballot and a Democratic ballot.
Oh, that doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter, see?
No.
No, actually, I think he's wrong. Dave, you can put either ballot, Republican or Democrat, through the same machine, can't you?
Yeah.
You can feed both ballots into the same machine.
Right.
It's just that at the end of the night, you have to separate the Republican primary ballots from the Democratic primary ballots.
All right, good. So that clears that one up. Kate?
This is a question for Jean. I think I know the answer, but we spent an awful lot of time in this committee talking about whether to do 8x11 envelopes for returning absentee ballots because of the plea from some moderators about the folding issue. Am I correct that your suggestion about renting or buying machines is in large part to address that issue?
Yes.
I'm in favor of renting machines for that.
Well, at the price that the Deputy Secretary just told us, if it's 2,000, well, if it's only $1,000 because we're only using them in the general election, and we had $50,000, which is the arbitrary number that Gene came up with when he thought it was 5,000 a piece and was going to buy 10 of them. So 50 may not be the right number, but I think I'm perfectly happy to have a recommendation that the Secretary of State consider doing this after it determines what the need is and to the extent there's money left over. But, you know, it's sort of like the hotline. It's not high on our priority list, I don't think. I mean, it would be lovely to have. I'm not discounting that, but.
I can't let you out.
Let that go. So anybody, Barbara?
I think it's a good idea. And my guess is that by mid-October, you're going to have a pretty good idea of what communities might have a really high absentee ballot return. Hopefully, if the education and the hotline and things are going, you know, I can see some wards and cities or some other districts having high turnout. And even if it was only a couple of machines, that you might have some places that you want to go. On the other hand, I know that things get pretty testy. I do think we need to leave it to the Secretary of States, because I don't want the clerks all fighting between each other as to who gets the machine.
Yeah, let them fight with Dave. Is that okay with everybody? To the extent the money's available, we'd recommend leasing after he determines the need, and let them administer it.
Mhm.
And obviously, it's just for the towns that already have machines. We're not making them available to towns that hand count, so, which tend to be the smaller ones anyway. All right. That's what we'll do. Roman numeral 4, non-spending recommendations. Now, obviously, to the extent we talk about spending money on any of these non-spending recommendations, they become spending recommendations. I got that part. But I thought we'd go through them. Applications for absentee ballot, request for registration by mail. That goes to the form. Jean wrote a long section on processing and on different things. I don't know what comments he might have to amend what he wrote already, or if other people have comments or questions on them. This is basically process, and we know some of it would need some tweaks in the law. So Jean, why don't you tell us if you have any changes?
I will send you, Brad. They're basically editorial, and I don't think we need to discuss them, with one exception. Kate
Okay.
raised a valid question. If we're recommending that the commencement of absentees can start soon as the polls open, the processing of absentees as soon as the polls open, there's this nettlesome provision in the law that permits 10 voters to vote or to make a motion and demand that absentees can't be opened up until the close of the polls. And that needs to fall by the wayside, along with allowing the absentees to be started to be processed at the time the polls close. So originally I thought, you know, we don't need to really mention that and highlight it, but we probably do, because if it isn't taken care of, if somebody wants to obstruct the process, they can do it. And this would certainly not be the year that we'd want that to happen, because if you can't start processing absentees until, 7 o'clock at night, you're going to be there till 7 o'clock the next morning.
Aren't there a couple more? I sent you a response to that had a very, now that we're talking about it in public session, probably what I'm about to say goes out the window. But if we put it in the report that RSA such and so allows 10 voters to do it, we're giving them a roadmap on how to do it. I would rather have a general statement saying to change the processing to make it more efficient would require some 2020 only changes in the law, and not describe it that way. I mean, I think for 2020, from what we've heard, if somebody chose an absentee ballot, I'd give them one shot at the apple. I wouldn't say you can come in and vote by regular ballot on election day if you filed an absentee ballot. So, that might be another one that needs it.
Well, let me ask either Dave or anybody else that might be able to assist us. Dave, do you have any idea whether the executive orders that may come out after we finish up doing what we're doing are likely to favorably look upon this notion of accelerating the processing of absentee ballots, including, doing things like checking the checklist before election day and/or starting the actual opening them up, et cetera, when the polls open. I mean, is this likely to be favorably looked upon?
All I can say is that there will probably be a discussion on that, after we get through the filing period, start looking at, how the processing of absentee ballots might look closer to the election at a time. I know that the particular provision that we're talking about has been a topic in the past for legislation. Never really did anything with it. It has never really been abused or even used, and that's not to say that it couldn't be. It will certainly be on our list of topics to discuss as we look at how the actual procedures are going to take place for the upcoming elections.
Well, in light of that, I don't know whether you want to mention it or not mention it, Brad. It's kind of an
Well, I
analogy.
think
Don't ask, don't tell.
we either should mention it in this section as things that need to be changed, and you've got a whole bunch of things in here that would have to be tweaked to make it more efficient. Or we say it in the last section if we're going to have a last section on 2020 only law changes. But clearly, I guess my statement about we're going to be flagging it for somebody who wants to do it, if they really want to do it, maybe they can do it anyway. So I guess we probably ought to say it.
Yeah, I think so too.
Okay, so why don't you add whatever you think you have to add about Kate's thing to when you're sending the editorial changes for your section.
Yeah.
And put that in. Tom, you had your hand up.
I just want to make sure we're addressing, I've had suggestions from moderators all the way from 5 days before the election to the day before the election in our cities. And what they're looking to do is typically open the, actually there's two different levels, and that's one is to open the return envelope and check them off the checklist, and then hold on to the affidavit envelope with that intact. And that keeps the ballot with the voter, basically. And the other one is to process down to the level of the ballot, check them off the checklist as absentee, and then that 2-hour rule is gone. And but no matter what we recommend or say might be useful in this process, the general vote in these larger cities and towns, in the responses I've gotten, is that there's no way they will be able to get this job done if they have a significant increase in absentee ballots on election day. So I think we should have it there as an option. It will require either an executive order or a 2020 only election law change, but it's sort of one of the fundamentals. I started getting emails about this before we'd ever met. So some level of early processing that may or may not do in the 2-hour rule is something that I think we need to put in this report
I agree.
to reflect the public input.
Well, yes. Barbara?
I was thinking about this issue, and I agree it's an issue, but I just want to say, I'm not sure how big of an issue it's going to be. We heard from Kathy that clerks are opening up the envelopes before, the physical opening of this and the clipping of it with the application and checking it all in has been done before by towns and needs to be done because a lot of them have registration material in it that they're going to deal with. Or I guess the ballot, that's different. But my point is that if we're successful in getting a higher absentee ballot turnout, that means we have less people checking in, which means the disruption that you have by processing the absentee ballot, which really is, the disruption is really going to the checklist table and getting the ballot marked AV, hopefully it's not going to be so disruptive because we're not going to have as many people standing in line. I mean, that's my comment on it.
Okay, well, it would be great if a combination of that made it easy to do, but I think, Jean, include the needed changes in the thing, and I hope Barbara is exactly right on what's going to happen. Kate?
One quick question for Jean. I think you were going to include a provision in your tome here that says that if we, in conjunction with our recommending that processing start 2 days early or 5 days early, obviously all of that will have to be subject to public scrutiny.
Yes, I have started to draft that, and I put that in, Kate.
Thanks.
Okay, thank
And
you.
let me just say, as a correction point, I think, Barbara, that what Kathy said about clerks opening up the mailing envelope before Election Day, it's only those ones that are marked that the voter is unregistered and has registration material. I don't think that there's anybody, at least if they know what they're doing, who's opening up the mailing envelope in other than that situation. Am I right, Kathy?
Well, yeah, other than there's a provision to do it, in the morning before. Dave can clear that one up, because we've never done it because we've never had to. But I think there's a provision to just slit open on election day.
On election day.
Prior to the casting.
Yes,
But
that's
not 5 days, 2 days, no. The only ones that get opened or slit are the ones that we're taking the absentee registrations out of.
and yes, that's exactly right. And the way I wrote it up was that the critical piece that we would all recommend is to allow this checklist issue to be dealt with before Election Day, because that's really the most disruptive thing in the election, is having to send these people back and forth from the counting, from the absentee ballot processing group to the checklist, checking names off the checklist, stopping the line where voters, in the big towns, you have to actually stop the line, and that's a problem. So at any rate, we'll put in both options, but definitely recommend that the checklist situation can be dealt with in advance.
Then on the last page of Gene's materials, he had a footnote that talked about the committee being split on the question of presenting documentary evidence for the absentee registrations. I thought we dealt with this, but maybe we hadn't. The question put simply is whether an affidavit like same-day registration would suffice in an absentee registration, or whether the presently required stuff that has to come in with it should be retained. And I thought we had at least taken an informal poll about that. And I don't remember if it was 4-2 or whether it was 3-3, frankly, but Tom.
I recall in that discussion, I don't remember taking a vote, but I recall in that discussion, the point, again, that I don't see any reason why absentee should be significantly more difficult than in person, especially in 2020. And so my recommendation for 2020 is to allow an affidavit with a signature and a photo to suffice in the absentee registration process, rather than having to have all the additional documentation, which you don't have to do it same day. And I think we did point out, or I think we all agreed on one thing, which was that we would like to see fewer absentee same-day registrations if possible, because they are cumbersome. They're the ones who are going to have to drop their masks. They're the ones who are going to have to spend extra time with a single poll worker. And that's my feeling, is that if you really want to have an impact on same-day absentee registration, You should have the same standard for the absentee that you have for the in-person. That's my opinion on it.
Kathy?
Well, I don't entirely disagree with that, Tom. The reasoning is that at election, if they come in election day, you're going to send them home to get it. If they do it absentee, they're at home. So they should have that stuff there. That's the difference in reasoning between signing an affidavit because you don't want to send them home to get it. But if they're doing it at home absentee, they should have that at home.
Yeah,
But if it comes in, I have never been an election official, and I have been persuaded by this process never to be one. But if it comes in after the supervisors of the checklist last meeting, doesn't it present the same kind of bureaucratic problem for the supervisors of the checklist and for the poll workers when they have to open the thing? If we require, which I think I favor, but if I'm trying to understand what I'm doing to people if I say that, if the increased number of applications have a number of registrations in them, and every time there's a registration, people have to look at the supporting documentation, that either A is or B is not a big problem. And I don't know how many there are going to be. I don't know how fast the supervisors of the checklist can look at those things and say, yep, that's fine, or nope, that's not fine. But there's no way to call if it's 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it's probably pretty hard to call the voter and say, come in here with some other stuff. So I just don't know what we're doing here. So, Gene.
I'm not exactly sure what you were asking, but I can say this, that the general problem of telling the voter that they didn't submit the requisite information to register absentee can be solved in part if the Secretary of State, and I think it's in in your draft, I'm not sure, or if it isn't, it should be, the Secretary of State should be recommending very strongly to the supervisors of the checklist that they don't wait until 6 days before the election to have their one and only meeting to deal with all of the people that they've received registrations from. That they have multiple meetings. Admittedly, it's easy for us to say because we're not the ones that have to do it, but that's it goes with the territory. And I think we can't do anything about it. We can't make the supervisors do it, but the Secretary of State can strongly recommend that, and that will dramatically ameliorate the problem that I think you were addressing, Brad, and that is of the last minute thing, because admittedly, if it's at the last minute and it isn't done within the time, then it can't be remedied and they have to go and register in person at the polls. But that's just because that only happens if, in fact, the supervisors were to wait. Well, could happen two ways. If the supervisors wait until the last minute, or if the registrant waits until the last minute. And we can't do much more than we're already doing to encourage the registrant to not wait until the last minute. But we can do something, or at least the Secretary of State can, to encourage the supervisors to not wait until the last minute.
Okay, so I think people have heard this subject a lot of times. I'm going to ask each of you to tell me whether you're in favor of the affidavit or the present proof stuff. Kathy?
If it was a one-time only for the 2022 elections, then I would be in favor if it were changed to the affidavit.
Okay. Kate?
Yes, I'm in favor of the affidavit for this election only. And I also want to say that if we don't agree on that, that at very least, I think people should be able to use their iPhone to take a picture of the documentation.
Oh, absolutely.
Gene?
No,
Keep it the way it is.
keep it the way it is.
All right. Barbara?
Keep it the way it is.
Oh, goody. was afraid this was gonna happen.
I still get to vote, don't I?
Yeah.
Oh, I knew how you were gonna vote. I already had you counted.
Well, I just wanted to give you something to chew on, Brad, and that's the number of people who don't have copiers in their home. A large number,
They all have cell phones.
but cell phones aren't allowed anyway.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so this would take a serious change in the law. We understand that part. So this is on the presumption that somebody would agree, who has the power to change the law, would agree to do it.
I'm ready for you, Brad. We can do it.
Not gonna happen, Brad.
Wait for the, yeah, I want to get our 2020 legislation through the corner office 2 times. So I guess I'm persuaded by,
Can I?
damn. Yeah, go ahead. Persuade me quick, because I'm not persuaded. I don't know how to vote on this. And that's not normal, but it's, I mean, my gut and my experience says we got to prove, we got to have the same security and we got to have the same proof. The practicalities of this year are a little different. I don't think the administrative burden for people to decide, looking at the stuff that's in the envelope, is that tough. But I guess if you can't decide, you go with the status quo. So I guess I'm for the status quo. So that makes it 3-3. So the footnote is correct. We are split,
True.
which I really didn't want to do. But if the legislature wants to decide this one for us, Tom, go to it. All right, then we get to the other stuff. I'm going to try to get through these by 4 o'clock, but if I can't, we're going to stay until I can. The remote sites, additional opportunities for voters to register and vote absentee. I've been harping on this since day one. I think I'm the biggest fan of this one. We've already heard from a lot of clerks saying they're planning to do this. And I don't think we have money in the CARES Act till to do it. So, Jane.
I think the frequently asked questions that the Secretary of State's office put out to the supervisors absolutely recommends this. Am I right, Dave? Doesn't it recommend that the supervisors and clerks make special accommodations during this period for people to come in and register, drive up, come out to their car, et cetera, et cetera?
Yes, we're asking them to be as accommodating as possible.
Okay, so is that okay to leave with the recommendation that we don't have any money to pay for it? Okay, hearing no opposition. Election day safe procedures is sort of redundant. We talked about it extensively, or Tom's subcommittee talked about it extensively. I don't think there's anything wrong talking about it. I think the point on including it here is we don't think we have extra money to pay for it. We did get some, I've gotten some feedback both from individuals and by reading stuff in the paper, which may or may not be true, that towns have a separate ability to apply for CARES Act funds. And one of the things they use it for is safe elections in their own municipality, which is why I included that language in there. And I did say we spend money on it if there's any money left over, which is a pipe dream. Added and substitute staffing. We talked about it. It certainly from day one was something we talked about paying for because it was an additional cost necessitated by the COVID thing. But I put in the recommendation shouldn't be paid for from federal funding because of that additional funding that may be available. Tom.
Yeah, the only comment I would have on this is we heard from several polling place people, that staffing can vary by polling place, and it's not necessarily based on need. And so that means that for us to pay more because people want to have more, in other words, the ratio of voters to staff varies from place to place. So I would absolutely not recommend paying extra. And if we were going to pay extra, it would be using some formula that the Secretary of State devises that would be based on voter volume through a polling place rather than just, I want more staff. And I don't know how Kathy feels about that. She's much more expert, and I see her hand up. So
Kathy?
No, I agree with that entirely. I think the last sentence, though, sufficient staff to handle the anticipated surge, I think Dave mentioned that as something that they were looking at to come up with some kind of a formula to say, okay, you know, it's increased 5 times. So assuming there's a cost associated with that, and they were working on coming up with numbers to accommodate that as being a reimbursable through them. Now, I'm not sure if that's still on the table or not, but Dave did mention that way at the beginning. Just that piece, the before handling, not the handling election day.
Okay.
One of my concerns about this election with the surge of absentee ballots and absentee registrations is the turnaround time for the clerks. I assume that varies greatly among different clerks' offices, but in this particular case, we are really going to need a rapid turnaround for sending out ballots, sending back registration packets, et cetera. And I would hope that part of our recommendation could be to the Secretary of State's office that there be some guidance on, in this critical election and the surge of everything, some guidance on the turnaround times. And that should be linked, I think, to the issue we're talking about of extra staff, because I would like it if the clerks could think early on rather than later about what are they gonna face in terms of needing more staff for that prompt turnaround time, and maybe Kathy could speak to that.
In my situation, we have an unusual situation because I did the job for 41 years and I work part-time for them. So we've already said, okay, we're saving a lot of that chunk, and I will go in every single day, including Saturday and Sunday, if we have a drop box, to get that done. And turnaround has always been instant in our town. You get an app in, you get it out, and you get it out to the post office. You don't just get it out to the pile of mail that's going out the next day. So it's always been a priority, but you've got some little towns that are going to have to be understanding that they only work 1 day a week. So they've got to still go in every single day and check, and they may have full-time jobs elsewhere. So there's going to have to be, I think, some direct guidance from above that says this year it's extremely important because of the numbers to get in there and get things out on time. And I mean,
the chat room is full of reminders that extra staff sometimes means extra hours by existing staff, and that costs extra money. But I got notes that say there should be additional guidance from the Secretary of State on what to anticipate and how to address it. So I think we'll amend it that way. Gene?
Yeah, I look at this the same way as the advice to the clerks and supervisors about remote sites for absentee registrants. Yeah, it's going to require some additional work, and there's no doubt about it. And if we try to quantify, the additional staff hours, et cetera, I think we're into an accounting nightmare. And I think all we can do is rely upon the Secretary of State to encourage this. And by the way, I mean, when we get letters like we got from the Monadnock group, all I can say is it's pretty obvious we've got some great people out there who understand, that we're in a problematic situation. They're going to do the job.
I couldn't agree with you more on that. The next item is free publicity. Obviously, we're not paying for free publicity by definition, but if obviously we've been talking from the get-go with every group that we talk to that once we've come up with, and the Secretary of State's come up with plans, they shouldn't be reluctant to get on every TV show and radio show they can. They shouldn't be reluctant to send out things and ask the press to run them. The town clerks and city clerks are already running things, educating voters on what's going on in their localities. It's necessary. It's as important a part of this process as others. And I think we've all seen the number of stories on voting, both in New Hampshire and other places in the last month, that it's a constant subject of conversation. Switching back on primary day, in Barbara's decision matrix, one of the things she showed us was a statute that she says already allows this. I think what we're saying to towns and cities is if you're not availing yourself of it, start.
Right.
And the Secretary of State can give guidance and perhaps send out a postcard if people don't know what they look like. Ballot size, unless anybody differs, the 8.5 by, is it 8.5 by 11 or 8.5 by 12 that we're talking about, Dave?
8.5 by 11.
Okay, thank you. I thought I had it right, but I'm not sure. I put in a thing about people with disabilities have to continue to be accommodated, which I don't think is rocket science. I didn't see in Jean's stuff, and we talked about it, maybe it was inadvertent, but we got testimony from one of the groups about instructions, not ballots and not applications, but instructions being printed in more than one language so that a lot of people, and Jean made a very valid point when I was discussing this with him by email, that you have to be able to show a proficiency in speaking English to get to be a citizen. I don't know if you have to have a proficiency in reading English, but we were urged to urge the Secretary of State to have things available in the same languages that HHS makes its programs available to. I don't know how important people think that is. I think it's important to show sensitivity to those groups, very frankly, but that's because I'm work with them a lot on a lot of my clients. But what do people think about that? And I don't know, Dave, what you do presently on different languages.
We can work on that. We try and stick as close to the statute as we can on guidance. Part of the problem in the past is when we've tried to simplify things, somebody it takes offense to what was drafted and we end up in court. So the practice has been keep it as close to the statute as you can, and that's the safe way.
Well, okay, what does the statute say?
I think you'll see most of the guidance and the informational items that we have on our website related to registering and absentee voting and things like that is basically a recitation of the statute.
No, I mean, I'm talking about putting, yes, I think you should recite things that way too. The question is whether they should be available to people to read in several languages.
That's something we can look at. New Hampshire is not a state because of the low population of minorities that speak different languages, that we're required to print ballots in that regard. And there is an expense that's involved with that.
Yeah, I'm not talking about ballots and I'm not talking about applications. I'm talking about the description to people on how the process works. I'm not.
And I think the same thing applies. I mean, it's something that we can certainly look at. Yep.
All right, thank you. The website, the Secretary of State's website, because I inquired of Dave, they have a contractor who is working on improving the website. Those of you who've been looking at it every day during this hearing process have seen living color arrive, different formats to arrive. It's still a work in process. People still have issues trying to find things on it, but I know they're working on trying to improve it. And basically what we're saying is keep trying, make it as easy as possible, because it's a really good tool for people to use. You know, if you needed to, I did say that the Secretary of State should consider spending, if there's any additional money left over. We have a lot of these categories in here, but if there's any additional money left over to enhancing its educational efforts and its informational efforts, and using some money to do it so people understand what's going on. So I don't know if anybody has changes or comments. Kate?
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that our subcommittee thought it would be a really helpful thing if the Secretary of State's office had a one-stop page or section for voting and registering during the COVID period. So one could go there and find the registration forms, which could be easily downloadable. Also, the absentee ballot application, which is already downloadable, but you have to find it under election forms. And if you could put that on that same section, very much like the Secretary of State's office recently did in a very productive manner on the form for change of party. Dave, you have that on your website. One can go to it and with one click, find the form, download it, and print it. So that's the kind of thing that we are advocating for.
Yeah, then that's in the report.
Forms, including the registration form.
Yeah, and your committee's language is in that section on having a one place and the language up on the computer. So I included your recommendation in there. Does anybody disagree with that recommendation? Tom?
I don't disagree. I just wanted to recognize the spirit and testimony that Luke gave, and encourage the Secretary of State. There is a multiple benefit from putting this stuff on the website, especially where there's no security issues, because it's really not secure information that people are entering. But these kind of interactive PDF portals, which, since you have a consultant now working with you, could save the clerks a lot of time and postage money. And what I think is one of the largest benefits is that they have required fields. So if you don't put in the information the clerk needs to process your request, the request doesn't go through. Right now, if the clerk gets the request with inadequate information, it doesn't go through and you may not end up being able to vote. So I just encourage, and this is sort of a 2020 and beyond, is, I think the the change in affiliation shows how nimble your office can be. And my hat's off to you. I think it was within a week of that executive order, you had that plug-in on the website, and it was perfect. And but thinking a little bit further, nothing that would jeopardize the security that you've been so careful to protect, and I agree with, but being able to use some of these interactive PDFs would be very helpful for the clerks. And also, we heard from the disabled population. So I would, if it could be done before the 2020 election, some of these things that wouldn't require statutory change, I'd be jumping up and down and cheering. But I think you're off to a great start with this affiliation change. And I think this sort of puts that into some writing. So thank you.
Good, thank you. Anybody disagree with any of that? I will add something about the interactive portal example for things that don't involve security.
Mr. Chair, if I,
Yeah.
I put it in, that's fine, but I would just point out that I think as we talk about automating things, that there is a legislative component to it also, because historically our elections have been handled person to person by our clerks and our supervisors with the people who we reside with in our community. And that's been the real fail safe to the election system in New Hampshire. And the more we automate it without boundaries on it, the risk grows in regards to maintaining that fail-safe. And I'll just give an example. In my town, in particularly municipal elections, we get absentee ballot requests for other states. In most cases, our clerk will know exactly who it is and that they're so-and-so, and she sends them off. But I just think that we need to keep that in mind as we go forward. Thank you.
Yep. Well, I'll be sure to emphasize non-security matters.
Brad,
Then, yes, Gene.
just very briefly. I already cover this in a section. I have to check your report. I didn't get right to the final part. You may have deleted it, but Kate and I have gone back and forth a number of times on it, that deals with this whole issue and distinguishes very carefully between the application for an absentee ballot, which contains very little significant personal information that can be hacked or privacy concerns. And that's what Luke was proposing, was a fillable form for the application for an absentee ballot. And what I included in here was, it's a good idea, and if they can do it, fine. I distinguish, however, the application or the forms for voter registration by absentee, which has got a whole lot of personal information on it, and that's a very different animal. And at least I, for one, do not believe that we should be advocating, and I didn't write it that way, that we should be advocating that at least at this time, in this environment, where cybersecurity is still a big issue, we should be advocating that be fillable online.
Oh, no, and I agree with that completely. I think I left it in, but I'll make sure it's there. And the final one, L, is independent candidates and third parties. Now, we heard, and I can attest, and I think anybody who's ever tried to thread the needle on what you need to do to become an independent candidate or get a third party on the ballot, on a good day and regular times when everybody's healthy, it's almost impossible. And I suspect it was done that way because the people who passed it weren't members of third parties or independents, but be that as it may. But the law is very tough. We heard from the Libertarian Party on its opinion that it's going to be virtually impossible to collect petitions. So the question is, do we want to have language in this report on independent candidates and third parties? It would take a change in the law. The governor has already opined on this subject in a news conference, as I understand it, saying that he was not going to include it in an executive order. But does the committee want to point that out, that that's something that's been made more difficult by COVID, or do we want to leave it alone and leave it out? I think my personal opinion is, that's why I included it, is that including it points out something else that's been made difficult by the pandemic. Whether those capable of making changes in the law want to change it or not is not up to us. My personal opinion is we got to include it, but I'm all ears. So start with Barbara.
Thank you. Well, I mean, I think included, it was testimony we heard. I think we ought to acknowledge that we heard it. I personally don't think it's an issue. This was a party that was previously on the ballot, and if they had gotten a certain percentage of the vote, they could have stayed on the ballot. So, the requirements are there statutorily. I don't have an issue with them, but it needs to be mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Kate?
I agree with you both.
Okay. Kathy? You're muted.
Sorry. I agree with both Kate and Barbara and you.
Okay, Tom?
I got it. Sorry, it wouldn't unmute. I agree, and I absolutely agree that it would require a change in the law to do any of this. So,
Oh, yeah, no, there's no question about it. But Gene?
I'm on board.
Okay, thank you. Section 5 talks about changes in the laws. This is the 2020 only legislation or executive order that would, in essence, make a lot of the things that we've said would streamline the process easier. I tried to tailor it very carefully, both as a message to those in authority to do something, and also to make sure it was limited, as Senator Sherman has described to us, as 2020 only and sunsetting after the November election, so that it's not accused of being tinkering with all our election laws. It might, in fact, create a situation that was like a laboratory for demonstrating that certain changes could be made, and the people that aren't in favor of them would probably still be against them, including me. But does anybody have any issues with that section? Kate?
Just a minor change that I'd like to see, and that is the second or third sentence that says it's unlikely that changes enacted by the legislature of a fundamental nature would be able to be implemented for this year's elections. I don't really think that is up to our committee to
Yeah, I can take that.
comment on, and I think we should leave it out and leave it up to the legislature.
Okay, that's fine.
and in reality, we can pass something, have it signed by the governor, and it's effective on passage. So
Right.
it would be rather swift.
And my suspicion is neither the legislature nor the governor is going to want to, with all the other things that are going on for them, make fundamental changes this year anyway. So that's fine, Kate. I'll take that on.
Brad,
Yes, Gene.
just one question or one thought, and I don't feel strongly one way or another, but I think we all agree that this is of significant importance from a political point of view. And by political, I don't mean partisan political, but just the politics of people dealing with each other, and how the legislature is going to feel about our work and how the governor is going to feel about it. And I'm just suggesting you might want to consider moving it up to the head and putting it up in the introduction.
I referenced it in the introduction. But let me think about that.
Okay, that's all.
And then there's a conclusion, and the conclusion said, we appreciated the assignment. We appreciated getting this. We thank the people who helped us because they have day jobs too, and this just added to their day jobs with probably no additional compensation. That's why we make the big bucks. And we appreciate the chance to do it. And then I said, this is important stuff. And I also said the last line to Kevin Landrigan yesterday on the telephone, and it got into the paper this morning. But I think it's important to say, we in the other states don't get this right. No matter what people's view of what the right outcome of elections are, this could affect the world forever. So I think it's important. As I told you, Exhibit A is the wrong one. We're going to replace it with another one. And the exhibits are the exhibits. So, Tom.
In that thanking component here, I just want to be absolutely sure we are thanking. I'm trying to find the one that we thank the public and the people who have devoted their time to following along with us. There's a number of them. I feel like they're my friends, and some of them make me, it's just sitting in the chat room every day. These people have been so devoted and so helpful. Vicki was a part of our subcommittees, and so I'd just like to recognize all the people who followed along with us and provided us with input and testified. and chatted and make sure we have a line in there.
Yes.
Because that's been just huge. And I think we've all tried to listen and be as responsive as we can. And in many ways, they've actually helped shape where we are now.
No, they've educated us for sure. And I think, I've said it in here a couple of times, but I think I, for one, and I think we all are, but some of you knew it better than I before, the unbelievable dedication and hard work that these local officials do, usually as volunteers or underpaid town and city officials, is just, and their creativity and the way they're handling this. And I fundamentally believe some of our assumptions about voters were underestimated the voters too, because I think voters are tougher than we gave them credit for in a lot of the things, but we're trying to make it easier so that they don't get sick and they don't get hurt. But those are very good suggestions, and I will add some stuff to that paragraph. And I, without trying to embarrass her, I will mention Vicky by name. So.
You mean the seventh member of the committee?
Right. He gets the same high pay we get.
Yes, yeah, we're going to double it though, because she did such a good job. Kate.
Before we adjourn, I wanted to bring up that age-old question of where is the Attorney General's opinion on absentee registration? We started talking about it on our first day, and this is our next to last day. And I think so much of our recommendations are geared toward absentee registration of this committee. I would suggest that we find out from Nick, if we can, whether we're going to have it by tomorrow. And assuming that we do not, I would suggest that we either withhold our report until we get it, or that we reserve the right in our report to revisit some of the issues that we're recommending about, because much of it depends so much on what the Attorney General's office is saying about absentee registration, and also whether there's going to be a governor's executive order on that.
So I think that both options that you outlined, Member Hannah, are completely reasonable and understandable. With respect to the guidelines and guidance, it's going to be a joint memorandum that will be published by both my office and the Secretary of State. I'm expecting that it will be published before the end of the week.
Thank you.
Great, Tom.
I just wanted to say, I doubt we have any influence on your thoughts on this, Nick, but all of us have been working under the assumption that the opinion does extend to absentee registration, and it would be a terrible disappointment to find that it didn't.
Senator Sherman, just to answer your question, I maintain throughout the committee's meetings and continue to do so that the same analysis that we applied to absentee ballot requests will apply to the absentee voter registration process. And the expectation will be that the publication will accurately and concisely reflect the same.
Awesome. Thank you.
And he might know. So, Barbara.
I come back to this. I mentioned this early. There was some chat room chatter that this issue had already been decided. The reason I took another look at it this week was because I was thinking in my mind there was an executive order directly relating to this absentee voting issue. And I realized that there wasn't. What we have is an opinion that said executive order number 16, which relates to scheduled gatherings of 10 or more, was applicable to voting places, and that therefore, in light of the fact that emergency orders in regards to the COVID issue remain in place, there is a restriction on gatherings, and therefore there was an opinion issue that indeed the COVID situation made polling place an area that absentee ballots made sense because of the number of persons. And I have not understood how that analysis from day one could apply to registration. And whether or not we should allow more or less by mail, we do it anyways, that's a whole nother discussion. But I think that It was very helpful for me to actually go back and read the executive order. So as we wait for that, I think that's fine. And I think we proceeded as if the registrations would go forward as we've discussed. And I'm not sure why that would affect the report coming out this week. And I appreciate Nick saying that he expects it to come out this week. But I don't want to hold up this committee for that representation because we all know things take longer than they say. Thank you.
Thank you all. We'll see you tomorrow at 11 o'clock. I will hope if Gene gets me his rewriting of stuff, I will have a new report, an amended report with all of the things we talked about today in it, in your inbox as soon as it gets done. So Kate may be the only one up at that hour since she's famous for answering my emails at 1 o'clock in the morning, but we'll
Mine
get it to
too.
you as soon as we can, and maybe
Thumbs
tomorrow's
up, too.
meeting, maybe the meeting will be short tomorrow. So it'll be, and Senator Sherman has a 1 o'clock appointment tomorrow, and I told him that we would be done well in advance of that. So we don't have to go to 1:30.
You all are invited. It's the election law and municipal affairs hearing.
Oh,
So,
just so we can talk about something new.
right.
Yeah, I would accept a motion to adjourn.
All moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. The chair votes yes. Barbara,
Yes.
Kathy,
Yes.
Kate,
Yes.
Tom,
Yes.
Jean.
Yes.
Jean and I are going right to our computers right now. Thank you, everybody. See you tomorrow.
Thank you.